Some weeks ago, back in June, before the television debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and of course, well before the events of last Sunday, former President Trump gave a very lengthy interview to Bloomberg. Bloomberg has only published this interview now, presumably in order to coincide with the Republican convention, which is now underway in Milwaukee, but also, no doubt, in order to give themselves the opportunity to undertake this tedious process of fact-checking, which now, much to my own personal annoyance, by the way, is a regular part of any interview, especially with someone like Donald Trump. If you actually go to the text of the interview itself, as opposed to the summary that Bloomberg has provided of the interview, you will see large chunks of what Donald Trump says highlighted, and in the margin there are the comments from Bloomberg purporting to correct errors that Trump is purported to have made. Now, I would quickly say that none of the errors seem to me to be of any particular serious nature, and none of them seem in any way to represent comments made by Trump in which Trump was seeking to mislead anyone. But anyway, this has now become regular, routine practice. I find it tedious and tiresome, but there it is. And, well, let's put that aside and let's go to the interview itself, because after the events of the last 3 weeks, I think that there is now a general consensus that though it is premature to say that Donald Trump is definitely positioned to be re-elected to the presidency in November, the odds that he will be re-elected in November have now greatly shortened, and the prospect now is that he will go into the election basically as the favourite and as somebody that most people now expect, and most governments now expect, will be the eventual winner, making him, as I understand it, the 47th president of the United States. So let's actually go to the interview itself. And for anybody who reads Bloomberg, I would strongly urge them not to spend too much time on the summary, but rather to go to the actual text, which Bloomberg helpfully provides of the entire interview. It is very long. It is typical of Donald Trump in being diffuse and in some ways rather overextended. He does sometimes meander a little, and his style of language is perhaps sometimes a little more ornate or flowery or diffuse or incoherent, you can choose whatever word you like, than one would ideally like it to be. But you get a much better sense of Trump at this stage of his political career, and you get a much better sense of the kind of presidency he intends to lead if he is elected in November than you do from the summary. And a number of things immediately stood out to me. The first is that, of course, the greater part of the interview is focused on domestic policy and on economic policy. And I have discussed in various places at various times the fact that Donald Trump, in terms of political thinking and indeed personality, is in some ways a throwback to an older America, and that this is one of the reasons why the American political class of today finds him very difficult to understand. I think I mentioned in a program on this channel some months ago, though it may have been that I said it somewhere else, that Trump reminds me personally very much of the Americans we used to see in Greece in the 1960s when I was a child. I can remember all kinds of comments and jokes from the various members of the Greek upper middle class, to which, of course, my family belonged, laughing at the Americans' crudity and vulgarity and flamboyance, but also, and this I very, very clearly remember, at the same time, greatly impressed by their energy, their drive, their sense of purpose. So this reminds me, as I said, a lot of the Trump of today. The same comments that we hear about Trump today remind me very much about what was standard commentary from the Greek middle class of my childhood about the Americans who used to visit Greece, often, by the way, on government business, sort of people you saw in the embassy, for example, back in the 1960s. But of course, it's not just that Trump is a throwback to the Americans of that time. It is economic thinking. He clearly thinks back further still. And it was interesting that the president that he mentioned and who he believes is greatly underrated is William McKinley, who was, of course, president of the United States in the late 19th century. He won a decisive election victory against William Jennings Bryan, who wanted to convert the currency onto the silver standard from the gold standard. Trump thinks McKinley a most underrated president. That, by the way, is a gathering view amongst a significant part of the academic community as well. Anyway, Trump considers him an underrated president. He clearly thinks highly of McKinley's economic policies, which were protectionist and which sought to build the American industrial base or assist in the building of the American industrial base through high tariffs. And he also clearly, though he doesn't say this, is heavily influenced by McKinley's views on foreign policy, which I will come to briefly. Now, this is one place where the summary by Bloomberg is wrong, in that it implies that, or rather says, that Trump considers that subsequent later presidents frittered away the golden legacy of McKinley. That's not at all the impression I got from the actual interview. Trump at one point says that Franklin Roosevelt used the enormous proceeds from the tariffs to finance the New Deal. It didn't seem to me that Trump was actually criticizing the New Deal as such. But running right through the interview is a belief in tariffs, a very, very strong belief in tariffs, a belief that protectionism is the way forward for the United States, a belief that the United States needs to focus first and foremost on its economic interests, a will to see a restoration of manufacturing in the United States, and a belief that this can be done through a combination of high tariffs and low taxes, low corporate and other taxes. And this would have been a fairly standard economic policy in the United States at any point in time from basically the American Civil War of the 1860s right up until the New Deal of the 1930s, and to some extent even beyond that. In fact, historians and others at the time sometimes refer to the American system, the style of economic management of that period, which favored protection, certain degree of infrastructural development and investment, and at the same time was extremely favorable to business, including through lower taxes. And that very much, it seems to me, is the economic philosophy of Donald Trump today. And I noticed that amongst the team of people, economic figures that Trump has assembled who are advising him is Mr. Laffer, well-known economist from the Reagan era, the man who came up with the Laffer curve idea. I understand that many economists don't take it especially seriously. But anyway, the idea being that beyond a certain point, if taxes are cut, economic growth will take off, and that the benefit will accrue in higher tax receipts, even despite the fact that taxes themselves are actually lower. Anyway, that's the Laffer curve, and its inventor is now one of Trump's advisors. So it was all very interesting, and as I said, throwback to an earlier time. Those who are familiar with the economic history of the United States can certainly see that. But of course, it's also Trump's views on foreign policy that seem to me to be the most interesting ones. And though he didn't make the direct link with McKinley, it seemed to me that just as Trump is thinking of returning in some ways to the economic philosophies of the McKinley era, he also seems to be a throwback or thinking back to the foreign policies of the McKinley era as well. Because McKinley was very far from being an isolationist. This concept really didn't exist. But he was also somebody who very much did believe that the United States should be primarily focused on looking after itself. He was deeply skeptical, for example, of the Spanish-American War of the 1890s. He believed very much that the business of America is business. That was not an expression that McKinley himself came up with. I understand it dates from the 1920s, but it is definitely one that would have reflected the thinking of McKinley and of his administration. And as well as being a conservative, a supporter of protection and high tariffs, McKinley definitely was somebody who basically felt that the United States should mind its own business and focus first and foremost on itself, on its own development. And that, again, is something that permeates the entire interview that Donald Trump has given. So, most interestingly, for example, he seemed much more skeptical than many people might have assumed about US support for Taiwan. He complained that Taiwan had basically stolen America's entire chip industry, perhaps a bit overstated. This is one of the places where Bloomberg does a fact check, saying that it's not true that Taiwan took over 100% of America's chip industry, even though it does produce 92% of the world's most advanced chips. The remaining 8%, by the way, I suspect, are now being made in China. But anyway, never mind. Anyway, the point is that Trump said that Taiwan is a very rich country. It's managed to grow economically, he implied, partly off the back of the United States. He is skeptical, therefore, as to why the United States should be spending so much, taking on so much to defend Taiwan. He spoke rather bluntly of the United States acting like an insurer for Taiwan's independence. One of the interesting things about Trump is the way that he does tend to see things in these very transactional, financial terms. And he made what I thought was an absolutely simple, straightforward point, that Taiwan is vast distances away from the territory of the United States. Taiwan is located, I think he said, 68 miles from the Chinese mainland. It's not a winning proposition for the United States, therefore, to defend Taiwan, and besides, why would it want to? So this position Trump has on Taiwan, I suspect, would surprise some of his supporters on the Republican side. And of course, it is completely contrary to the approach taken by the current administration, which constantly reassures China that it wants to, that it recognizes and abides by the one China policy, even as simultaneously it does everything it possibly can to sever the link between Taiwan and China, and says, or hints repeatedly, Joe Biden himself, by the way, has openly said that it will defend Taiwan from what the administration calls Chinese aggression. That really doesn't seem to be what Trump himself is looking for at all. I think that if he could park the problem of Taiwan, let it revert to the situation that it was in before, where the Chinese claimed sovereignty over Taiwan, the United States acknowledged the fact, but Taiwan just carried on much as it always had done. I think he would probably be quite happy to return to that, which I suspect is what the Chinese would be happy to see as well. And in fact, I found Trump's comments about China altogether extremely interesting. Trump talked about how his personal relations with Xi Jinping had been extremely friendly, very good, up to the point when the pandemic began. He said that obviously he wanted to defend American economic interests from China. He spoke about how China had taken advantage economically of the United States for 30 years. But he went out of his way to say that he had no particular hard feelings against the Chinese, and that he was willing to work or return to good relations with Xi Jinping. Again, his entire thinking about China is narrowly economic and focused on American domestic interests, the big geostrategic issues, the great clash between great powers, and all of that didn't really seem to interest Trump at all. And the same was true about Russia. Again, he spoke about his good personal relationship with Putin. He made it fairly clear that had he been president, he didn't believe that a conflict like the one in Ukraine would have happened. By the way, as to that, he might even have been right. It seems to me that Trump, far more plausibly than Biden, would have acted in the months leading up to the start of the special military operation to dial down the conflict, to give the Russians assurances about NATO and missile installations in Ukraine and all that sort of thing, than Biden was prepared to do. But anyway, Trump still believes, or appears to believe, that he can find some way forward with the Russians. And again, my overall sense is that there is really no ideological issue in terms of Trump's perspective on Russia, no sense of some great superpower rivalry that needs to be played out. He, again, tends to see the things very much in terms of national self-interest, the specific economic and social interests of the United States and of its people. He doesn't really want a major conflict. And overwhelmingly, with respect to Russia, and to some extent China too, I got the clear impression that he wants to dial things down, that he wants to find some way back from this incredible escalation of tensions that we have found ourselves in today. And he made what, again, I thought was an extremely valid point. He pointed out that at the time when he was president, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, well, they might all be on reasonably good terms with each other, but they each tended to go their own way. Whereas now, 3.5 years since he was president, we have a completely different situation. A situation in which China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea have all come together, formed all kinds of associations and blocs with each other. They are openly hostile to the United States. At least that's how Trump sees it. And they are working together to counter the United States in every way that they can. And again, I have to say that I think this assessment is perfectly true. And when Trump implies that this might not have happened had he been re-elected to the presidency in 2020, well, on balance, again, I tend to agree with him. I think BRICS would have moved forward. I think many of the integration processes would have moved forward, but perhaps not with the level of intensity and purpose that we have seen play out over the last few years. Now, I'm going to make a general observation of my own about all of these things coming from Trump. On his domestic policies, on his ideas that cutting taxes and increasing tariffs is the way to go, and that this will lead to an economic renaissance in the United States, I am not so sure. I think that the world has changed very much since the 1890s when William McKinley was president. I think that trying to return to the economic model that worked well for the United States in the 1890s, given the completely different situation today, both globally and within the United States itself, well, I am much more skeptical that it would work. But on foreign policy, I found Trump's comments rational and sensible And if implemented, which of course, if he's elected president, we cannot be certain that they will be. But anyway, for what it's worth, rational and sensible, and if they are implemented, I think beneficial to the United States and indeed to the global situation altogether. The Europeans, of course, the neocons in the United States, people who believe that the United States is some kind of idea. I've pushed back against that claim, which neocons repeatedly make. But anyway, neocons who believe that the United States is some kind of idea, who think that it has some kind of mission to expand and extend itself and to make the world safe for democracy, which can only apparently be achieved through the unlimited expansion of the power of the United States and the destruction of all American adversaries. Well, for people who think like that, all of this is heresy. Everything that Donald Trump says is unacceptable and profoundly wrong. That, by the way, extends to his domestic policy as well. If Donald Trump were indeed to raise tariffs to the extent that he says, well, that would certainly mark the end of globalization as we have known it. And for the neocons and people like them, globalization is, of course, an integral part of the entire geopolitical project. So for them, all of this is horrifying, it's unacceptable, it's profoundly heretical. The Europeans, already shocked by the appointment of J.D. Vance as Donald Trump's choice for vice president, well, they will be horrified also by all of this. They will be horrified at the fact that Trump intends to raise tariffs against European industry. In fact, it's fairly clear that for Trump, his approach to tariff policy, trade policy altogether, is completely focused, as I said, on the domestic economic interests as he perceives them all on the United States. Sanctions, as such, really don't interest him very much. He actually says at one point that he doesn't actually like sanctions. So for him, it's tariffs, not sanctions anymore. But anyway, the Europeans won't like it. The neocons won't like it. The neoliberals certainly won't like it. They will all be extremely worried and unhappy that he is talking in this way. And they will be very, very nervous about what he does as president. Now, those of us with long memories will remember that in 2015 and 2016, many of these same themes that we're hearing from Trump now were expressed then. And it's fair to say that Donald Trump, though he did raise tariffs quite significantly on China, never fulfilled much of this agenda. But this time, he tells Bloomberg that he's confident that he has a much better understanding of the mechanisms of power in Washington, which I believe is true. And he does seem to have a much more coherent team of people around him than he did then. So maybe, despite all the opposition, despite all the anger and hysteria that we are certain to get if he is elected, maybe this time he will be able to move this project that he has forward in ways that he was unable to do before. We will just have to wait and see. Now, a few further quick observations. Trump's policy is not, so far as I can tell, to dismantle NATO. He didn't say anything like that I could see in this interview. He clearly has a somewhat negative view on the Europeans. He talks about, how attractive Germany and Scotland are, but they don't buy many American goods, or so he believes. And he clearly feels an urge to be more aggressively competitive with them. So I can't see how the West can really hold together if these policies that Trump is now advocating are ever fully implemented and gain hold in the United States. The fundamental fact about the construction of the Euro-Atlantic system, as it is now called, after the Second World War, is that the United States, from the 1940s onwards, worked very hard to integrate the European economies and to bring all the various parts of the European economy into one block and to integrate it with itself. And that tended to be true very much of what the United States was doing with all its various other allies as well. And I think it was very well understood then that this process of economic integration, or even unification, was essential to unify the Euro-Atlantic system, the NATO and Western alliance. Whereas the course of economic fragmentation, which Donald Trump is outlining, one in which the United States goes back to retreating behind high tariff barriers as it seeks to protect its industries. Well, I think that is fundamentally incompatible with the Western alliance and the Euro-Atlantic system. And if it ever gains traction, then I have to say that the process of disintegration of the Western alliance, as we have known it, will quickly begin and will quickly become irreversible. That's one thing I wanted to say. The other is that I also got the sense that Donald Trump has now come to a full understanding of the importance of social media in terms of the political conflict. A number of people have pointed out that amongst J.D. Vance's other aspects of his background is the fact that he worked in Silicon Valley and has connections with some of the more, shall we say, conservative or libertarian or independent parts of social media. Trump apparently seems to feel that some sort of change in focus for social media is needed after what happened to him in his first term. He clearly doesn't think very much of Meta and of Zuckerberg, just saying. And interestingly, and perhaps a sign also of a concession to China, he seems to have shifted his feelings about TikTok. He no longer supports the ban on TikTok as he once did. He seems to recognize that some degree of competition is needed, and he clearly doesn't want a situation where Meta basically dominates this field in the way that it did before TikTok came along. Just so. Anyway, I thought overall an interesting interview. I have, as I said, some skepticism about aspects of his economic policy. I think that it might be, as I said, difficult to go back to the 1890s and implement and do things in the same way that were done then and expect the same kind of results. Though I would say again that the United States is a complex country with a huge and diversified and very complicated economy. And I accept that things might turn out otherwise than I expect. But his foreign policy, which, as I said, does seem to me to be a reversion, like his economic policy in some ways, to the ideas which were prevalent in the United States, certainly before the Second World War, and which were dominant before the First World War, I think make a lot more sense for today's world than the current policies which are being pursued by the current administration. Anyway, I've discussed this interview at length. It's the most elaborate discussion by Donald Trump of his ideas that I've seen up to now. I noticed that he doesn't outline a plan for peace in Ukraine, though he clearly is no more attracted to the idea of indefinitely supporting Ukraine than he is to the idea of indefinitely supporting Taiwan. Just saying. But anyway, we shall see where it all goes. Let's move on, because even as huge events are taking shape in the United States, in Ukraine itself, we're starting to get, at least I'm starting to get, a sense that the ground is finally shifting underneath Zelensky's feet. Now, yesterday, the Times of India published a story and published a video about it as well, one which a member of the Duran community sent to me. Anyway, they published a story claiming that the military commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, General Syrsky, has now come to the conclusion that the war is lost, that Ukraine has lost the war, that it cannot prevail against Russia, and that some kind of peace, some are even calling it surrender, is now unavoidable. And according to the Times of India, there are criticisms, mounting criticisms within the Ukrainian political system from all the usual people, criticizing Syrsky for this defeatist attitude, and also, no doubt, pressing for his removal. Now, that was in the Times of India. And then a few hours later, the New York Times came up with another story saying that Ukraine is now looking for some mechanism to begin negotiations with Russia, and that it expects to be engaged in direct negotiations with the Russians towards the end of this year. That, of course, would mark a radical shift from Ukrainian policy up to now, in theory at least, or legally, if you prefer. Ukraine cannot negotiate with Russia whilst Vladimir Putin remains president of Russia. Zelensky, very unwisely, issued a decree back in the autumn of 2022, prohibiting himself and the Ukrainian government from conducting negotiations with Russia whilst Vladimir Putin remained Russia's president. Anyway, it looks as if, according to the New York Times, some Ukrainian officials at least are starting to rethink that approach and are coming round to the view that negotiations with Russia are unavoidable, and supposedly, and according to the New York Times, that is actually not just the intention, but the developing plan that the Ukrainian government is working on. And, well, there is perhaps a few other glimmers that might point in the same direction. There's been comments now, public comments by Zelensky, that at the next peace conference that is coming, the Russians will need to be invited and must participate in that peace conference if it is to go forward to any extent. And supposedly Zelensky has come round to that thinking, even though, strictly speaking, as far as I can see, even admitting that, even sitting down in the same room as the Russians and talking peace, even if dozens of other countries are there also, in my opinion, that would probably violate the literal language of Zelensky's own decree. Anyway, just saying. So we are starting to see some glimmers that the Ukrainians might be rethinking their overall strategy, that they are perhaps reconsidering the position that they are in. Probably there are very, very few officials in Ukraine who would go as far as General Syrsky is alleged to have, by the Times of India, to have gone. And it's important to stress, by the way, that we have no confirmation, none at all, that Syrsky really is thinking in terms of some sort of surrender. But anyway, it's likely that very few Ukrainian officials are prepared to go as far as Syrsky is supposed to be going, reaching the conclusion that the war is lost and that negotiations now are inevitable. But it does seem as if they are gradually coming round to the view that the war, even if it isn't fully lost, is going badly wrong. Western support for Ukraine is ebbing, and the moment has come, therefore, to rethink this policy of pursuing maximalist objectives, seeking to return to the 1991 borders, which is the one that Ukraine up to now has followed. Now, I said that Western support for Ukraine is faltering. There is, of course, the obvious sign of this in the rise in the United States, or the apparent rise in the United States, of Donald Trump, and in the various comments that he is making, and in the stance that Trump's pick as vice president, J.D. Vance, has taken. But there's also some rather interesting news coming out of Germany. Now, this has not been widely reported, but the German government appears to have concluded that it must reduce its own military support for Ukraine. Now, I get this from Reuters. There's apparently a lengthy discussion within the German cabinet about taking retrenchment measures to bring the budget, Germany's budget, under control. And as part of these retrenchment measures, it looks as if a decision has been made to slash spending on Ukraine. And this is the brief sentence with which Reuters reports this. Next year's budget will be less generous to Ukraine, with the government cutting military aid for the country to 4 billion euros from around 8 billion euros in 2024, according to a draft of the budget seen by Reuters. That's published by Reuters. It's not, so far as I've seen, been picked up and reported anywhere else. Strange fact, but there it is. Germany preparing to halve its military aid to Ukraine next year from 8 billion euros to 4 billion euros. This fact barely reported except by Reuters. Perhaps there's been more coverage of it in Germany itself. Well, of course, Zelensky will say that there's no cause for concern. NATO has agreed to provide Ukraine with $40 billion of assistance, financial assistance. There's the $50 billion loan, which is supposedly coming Ukraine's way, which is going to be secured against the proceeds of the frozen Russian assets. The Japanese government apparently is chipping in with another $3 billion. So there's all of that definitely going on. But notice that these are generally one-off payments. They would not, in my opinion, even if taken all together, suffice to keep Ukraine going even through 2025. But critically, Germany, which has been Ukraine's major economic and financial backer after the United States itself and its biggest supplier of military equipment after the United States itself, appears to be significantly downscaling the assistance it is going to start providing Ukraine after the end of this year. Just saying. So all of this, no doubt, taken together with the realities on the battlefield, may be starting to concentrate Ukrainian minds. There is something else, though. Just a day or so ago, Kirill Budanov, Ukraine's intelligence chief, made some very strange and elliptical comments. He said that the situation on the northern front lines, he seemed to be talking about Ukraine's northern borderlands, is supposedly dire. He said that a critical situation was developing there. He didn't want to say more, lest that provoke a panic. An interesting observation in itself. But anyway, whatever it was that he was talking about, it didn't seem to be going at all well for Ukraine. Now, on the face of it, he might have been talking about the battles in Kharkiv region, which we will come to in a moment. Clearly, there is a bad situation developing for Ukraine in Volchansk. But reading Budanov's words, to the extent that I was able to make much sense of them, I didn't get the sense that he was actually talking about the places where the existing fighting in Kharkiv region is taking place. Now, over the last 24 hours, there has been a rather interesting announcement from Russia, which perhaps can be explained, or at least can be connected to Budanov's words, because the Russians have announced significant restrictions on movement by civilians in certain of Russia's border areas bordering on Ukraine itself. Now, some of these areas include areas in the vicinity of the existing fighting in Kharkiv region, but others seem to be more related to places like Sumy region and all sorts of other places as well. And announcements of this kind by the Russians, announcements of restrictions on civilian movement, have in the past often been related to large-scale troop movements of troops and logistical supplies. Now, here I'm going to discuss something about which there's been a huge amount of uncertainty, but anybody who's been following the news about the conflict in Ukraine closely over the last couple of weeks will be aware that there have been constant rumours and chatter about some kind of fighting going on between the Russians and the Ukrainians along the border west of Kharkiv region. There have been reports that the Russians have on occasion occupied certain villages, certain border villages. One of those villages supposedly recaptured by the Ukrainians. The Russian Defense Ministry has had absolutely nothing to say about this at all. No Russian official has done so. There is a massive dearth of film footage and photographic footage from this area. There have been significant movements of Ukrainian troops to this area as well. This was an area where about a week ago, a big convoy of Ukrainian vehicles was caught in the open by Russian drones and was essentially destroyed, for example. Drones, and I think there was also an Iskander missile strike against this particular convoy. And there's been sort of chatter, rumours, suggestions that a lot more fighting is going on in this area than anybody is acknowledging up to this point. Well, who knows? That may be true, or it may not be true. One thing is indisputable, which is that the Ukrainians themselves have been publishing a lot of footage of FPV drone attacks on Russian installations on the Russian side of the border in this particular area, all of which might suggest that something is indeed going on in this area, which has the Ukrainians concerned. But I won't pretend that I have any idea what exactly is going on. But I wonder whether some kind of big Russian build-up is underway here, whether the Russians aren't concentrating large forces around on this specific area of the border, whether perhaps at some point over the next few weeks a major Russian advance into Ukrainian territory might take place, and whether this is what Budanov himself is worried about and is talking about. Now, there is one further hint that the Russians might have something more up their sleeves, and this comes from the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who of course was recently in Moscow talking to Vladimir Putin and other Russian officials as part of his shuttle diplomacy, which took in Ukraine, Russia, China, the United States, and culminated in a meeting with Donald Trump. Anyway, Orban is supposed to have warned European officials that he was told by Putin over the course of his visit and meeting with Putin in Moscow that the Russians are preparing something very big, which will happen at some point over the next few weeks. It's clear that Orban doesn't know what that is, but maybe this also is in some way connected with the events on Russia's northern border. I want to say again that Orban has said nothing about this in public. This is information that we're getting from second and third hand about discussions Orban is supposed to have had with European officials after his various trips. Apparently he discussed these also at the NATO summit meeting. Who's to say? It may be that all of this is exaggerated and it's untrue, that we have all of these bits and pieces of information that are being spread and put together, but that they don't really amount to very much. It's very, very easy in this conflict to put 2 and 2 together and make 5. But it could also be the case that some big Russian operation in the border regions, the northern border regions, is indeed being planned, and that this is what is making the Ukrainians particularly nervous as their attempted counterattack in Kharkiv region to throw the Russians back from Volchansk and in the Lipsy area appears to have failed, as the situation everywhere else on the front lines goes from bad to worse for them, and that the fact that they are worried about this renewed Russian offensive in an area not that far from Kyiv itself. It may be that it is this which is now causing them, taken together with the rise of Donald Trump and the flagging support in Europe, to rethink their political strategy and to float the possibility of negotiations. Well, we'll have to wait and see what happens. I want to stress again that the Russians, if they do have plans in this area, are keeping them very much to themselves. And Budanov, who is clearly hinting that he knows quite a lot, is also refusing to say what he believes is exactly taking place. Now, I mentioned Kyiv. At this point, perhaps, it's worth pointing out that over the last couple of hours, it seems as if there's been major power outages in Kyiv, that large parts of the city are again without electric power. There are mounting water shortages across the city as well, which is a major concern from a public health point of view, by the way. But anyway, that the situation in Kyiv is becoming very difficult. Now, this, of course, is all happening in summer, where, incidentally, Ukraine is currently experiencing a heat wave. If this pattern continues and extends into the winter, where, of course, temperatures in this part of the world regularly fall below zero, well, I don't want to even think about the consequences of that. But virtually everybody appears to believe that they will, that in come the winter, these power shortages will not only continue, but will, if anything, get very, very much worse. Now, since I'm on the subject of power cut-offs and shortages and blackouts in Kyiv, I think it might be helpful just to revisit the topic of that big missile strike that took place against Kyiv a couple of days ago, which included the missile strikes against the giant ATACMS factory in Kyiv. By the way, the number of Kh-101 missiles, which apparently impacted the ATACMS factory, where I'd originally said there were 3. Julian Röpke from Bild Zeitung said there were 5. I now believe there were 6. Further proof, if any were needed, that Ukraine's air defense system, including its air defense system for Kyiv itself, has effectively collapsed. But coming back to that missile strike, and by the way, touching on what happened in the missile that impacted with the Children's Hospital, there has been an extremely interesting article by John Helmer at his website, Dances with Bears. Now, Helmer, in my opinion, has been the single best and most insightful commentator in discussing what he refers to as the electricity war. He was the first person to point out, back in the autumn of 2022, when the Russians first started launching strikes on Ukrainian energy facilities, that the Russians at that time were not seeking to knock out the Ukrainian electricity system, but were first and foremost focused on discovering its weak points, which they could then attack at a time and place of their choice, perhaps in conjunction with a bigger Russian offensive, so that the entire electricity system would at that point collapse, making that offensive easier. And Helmer, I think, has been vindicated by events. We've seen how events have played out since then, how the Russians, having understood the system, the energy system better and better, have been able to refine and develop their attacks upon it. And according to Helmer, as well as the attack on the Artyom plant and on the air defense facilities in Kyiv, and we have confirmation, indirect confirmation from Ukrainian sources, that over the course of that strike, the Russians also struck at air defense facilities across Kyiv, including the main air defense center, with apparently large numbers of Ukrainian officers responsible for the operation of the air defense system wounded or killed. But alongside that, according to Helmer, they were again attacking various electricity transfer stations in the Kyiv area. And several of these, as it turns out, were located in close proximity to the children's hospital. And Helmer has pointed out, what, by the way, I've since established is basically true, that the building that was attacked was certainly part of the hospital complex, but was one of the more outlying buildings in some respects. And Helmer appears to believe that it was a KH-101 that struck this particular building, and that it was attacked because it was a facility, it was an energy facility in some way connected to the various others. Now, I say that there's been some clarification about the nature of the attack on the children's hospital, which I'd not appreciated, which is that it seems that the number of actual children who were reported killed in this attack was apparently nil. Now, I say apparently because I found this surprising, but I read this in various places now. If this is correct, then it seems as if, assuming this was a KH-101 and assuming that this did attack this particular building in the way that Helmer says it did, well, if that is correct, then clearly the target was not the main operating theatres and wards of the hospital. It was some kind of ancillary building to the hospital, which had some kind of power generating or distributing role, obviously a distributing role. Now, I have probably not done full justice to Helmer's article, which you can find in Dances with Bears. I find the whole thing completely intriguing. It may very well be true. Helmer, as I said, has been consistently right about the electricity war. I want to stress again that this is an area completely outside my own area of knowledge. I don't know the nature of this missile which struck that particular building. I don't know what that particular building was being used for. There's some reports that it was a Russian missile. The Russians themselves deny the fact and say that it was a ATACMS missile. The picture that I saw, and I accept again that I'm not the best person to understand pictures, but to me it did not look like a KH-101, but then, I'm hardly an authority on these things. So I'm not saying that Helmer's account of the actual strike on the hospital building is correct. But I will say that I think his picture, his description of the strike itself and on the attacks on the electricity substations inside Kyiv is most likely true, in which case that may explain the electricity shortages that we're hearing about in Kyiv now. Now, note that if Helmer is right, and I think the evidence on this wider issue points to the fact that he is, then by definition, it wasn't just 6 KH-101s that managed to strike the Artyom factory that got through. It looks as if all of the attacks on the electricity substations, and I understand that there were at least 3, and perhaps more than that, all of those strikes appear to have been done with KH-101s, in which case it's quite clear that the Ukrainians are not succeeding in shooting down KH-101s, even though the attack that took place happened in broad daylight. So anyway, there we are. Interesting account from Helm. But the overall picture, major deterioration of the situation for Ukraine, fears perhaps about a renewed Russian advance across the border, the northern border areas, massive casualties, mobilization, perhaps producing 120,000 men who cannot receive sufficient training in the time available, and growing doubts in Ukraine about the solidity of Western support. Trump openly skeptical about the war, Vance hostile to it, even Germany now starting to reduce support, a French election which produced a majority in the French parliament opposed to further support for Ukraine, and in Britain, a situation where the capacity for further support from Britain for Ukraine is to all practical purposes exhausted. So, a situation where one can perhaps begin to understand why Syrsky might be contemplating surrender and why Zelensky might very grudgingly and very unwillingly now be starting to move towards peace talks. It must be said that there continues to be a huge amount of magical thinking, however. Arestovich, Zelensky's former spin doctor, has now come up with a story, which may be true, that the Ukrainians, despite the fact that they've apparently decided, acknowledged that the war is lost, are still planning a further great counteroffensive. And the purpose of the counteroffensive, supposedly, would be as follows. It would be to experience another major Ukrainian defeat. Obviously, if the counteroffensive was successful, well, that would be marvelous. It would put the Russians on the back foot, and then Ukraine could negotiate perhaps from a position of strength. But if the counteroffensive fails, especially if it fails disastrously, then supposedly the thinking in Kyiv is that that might actually be even better. Because in that case, Zelensky and his officials can turn around and say, well, look, we've tried absolutely everything. The Russians are too strong. Our latest counteroffensive has ended in disaster. So the time has come to accept that we cannot win the war and that we must in fact talk. Supposedly, according to Arestovich, This is the only way that Ukrainian officials can think of shifting, pivoting away from their maximalist objectives and convincing Ukrainian society that negotiations with the Russians are necessary. I have to say that if this is the actual thinking in Kyiv, then it is nuts. It is unethical and stupid. Sending men to fight and die, if you think you're going to win, is one thing. But sending men to fight and die in order that you should lose so that you can make negotiations and your own position easier in some way for yourself seems to me not only crazy, but a horrifying betrayal of those men. I have to also say that as a political strategy, putting aside the moral dimension, it seems to me ridiculous as well. Surely, if there is another disastrous Ukrainian offensive, the Russians will come out of it feeling even more victorious than they are now. Who is to say that they might not advance even further and faster than the Ukrainians themselves expect, and that they will be even less willing to negotiate with the Ukrainians than they currently are? After all, Putin is already casting doubt on Zelensky's legitimacy as Ukraine's president. So perhaps at that point, having achieved that kind of a victory, Putin might harden his terms further. He might say, for example, that Russia cannot undertake negotiations unless Zelensky himself steps down and someone else, Viktor Yanukovych, the former president, Viktor Medvedchuk, the leader of the main opposition party, the head of the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, someone like that, unless someone else takes charge. And what would be the domestic reaction within Ukraine if there is another offensive and it ends in disaster, and then Ukraine begins negotiations? What are people like the Azov Brigade and Right Sector and all of those people going to say? They will be, it seems to me, trebly furious after this failure and far more likely to change the direction of their guns westwards than they would even be if some attempt to begin negotiations were to be initiated now. I don't know whether Arestovich knows what he's talking about, and I don't know whether what he's saying is true. But apparently there are other people in Ukraine who are picking up on what he's saying and who are repeating it and doing so in ways that suggest that they believe that it is true. If it really is true, then the people in Kyiv, the leaders in Kyiv, are even more detached from reality than even I had expected. Still, I'm not sure that this is true. I want to make that again clear. Though if it is true, if it does turn out to be true, then given the extent to which image and media management has been so much the priority of the Ukrainian government since the start of the war, well, if it is true, then it wouldn't surprise me. Anyway, let's now turn briefly to what's happening on the battlefront. I've spoken about the situation in Volchansk. We've had less information about it over the last couple of hours, but it does seem as if the Russians have now, as I discussed yesterday, stabilized and strengthened their positions south of the Volga River. So there's no doubt that the Russians are now south of the Volga River in force. They've reinforced there. It's highly likely that they will mount a further offensive there. There is also consensus, as I discussed yesterday, that the Russians have captured the whole of Makeyevka east of the Zherebets River, and further south in the Siversk area, there is also now significant amount of chatter that the Russians have advanced northward from Razdolovka, a village that they captured a couple of days ago, that they've advanced north from Razdolovka up the railways and are advancing through the two villages immediately to the north of Razdolovka that lead up to Siversk itself. As I've said previously, the web around Siversk appears to be tightening. Further south still, we've now had more information about the situation in Chasiv Yar. It looks as if the Russians have completely cleared the entire village of Kalinina. There was apparently a dacha community located to the north of it, which was administratively construed as falling within the territory of this village. Anyway, the Russians appear to have captured this dacha community. That makes it likely that at some point over the next couple of days, the Russian Defense Ministry will confirm that Kalinina, northwest of Chasiv Yar, is fully under Russian control. And there are reports that the Russians are pushing northward from Kalinina towards another village called Grigorivka, as I understand it, which is located somewhat to the north of Kalinina. This is another village located to the east of the aqueduct, that the Russians are heading towards the capture of that village, seeking to capture that village, presumably before attacking Chasiv Yar from the north, as they widen their positions on Chasiv Yar's northern flanks. So that's news from there. In the Toretsk area, there's been a lot of news. This is a very complex battle, not entirely easy to understand. I've said that there are two Russian pincer movements, one pushing through the northern part of the Toretsk conurbation, another through a more southern part of it, through the village of New York. It seems that the Russians have now reached the high-rise buildings in New York, which are the main fortified area there, and an industrial zone, a zone of industrial buildings. It looks as if the fighting in this area of Toretsk is extremely intense. And as I said previously, this is an area where the Russian Air Force is especially active. The most dramatic news, however, continues to come from the Ocheretino-Avdiivka area. There are reports this morning that the Russians have now captured the village of Lozovatska, the village that I said that they'd reached yesterday. Lozovatska's fall, if confirmed, apparently complicates Ukrainian supply routes in this area. I've discussed in a recent program how film that I've seen of the various small roads between these various villages show them practically deserted, with Russian drones constantly hovering overhead. So Ukrainian supply lines in this area look already very tenuous. But if you go onto a map and see where Lozovatska is located, southwest of Novo-Alexandrovka, you can see how the capture of Lozovatska facilitates Russian advances towards two key other villages, one being Vozvyzhenka, where the Russians have now reached the outskirts and which they're preparing to storm, thereby severing the main road from Pokrovsk to Chasiv Yar, and to Toretsk and Chasiv Yar. And the other being, of course, Progress, which is the next village that the Russians need to capture to the southwest of Lozovatska, on their way, presumably, towards Pokrovsk itself. It is increasingly looking as if the Russians actually do have Pokrovsk in their sights, that they're gradually working their way towards the actual capture of this important town. So this is a dramatic development. Pokrovsk, Progress is captured, and Vozdvizhenka is captured. The Russians are well within artillery range of Pokrovsk, and it seems to me that there are also roads that they could advance along towards Pokrovsk. There's one that leads directly from Progress to Mirnograd. It goes through two villages, Ivanivka and Grodivka. If Vozdvizhenka is captured, the Russians can reach the main road. There's two villages there, two other villages, Malinovka and Novoekonomichne. These are obviously old Soviet names which have been retained, but the Russians can advance along that road all the way into Mirnograd and beyond that into Pokrovsk itself. And further south from these places, there are now reports which appear to be confirmed that the Russians have captured around half of the village of Novoselivka Persha, and that the remaining Ukrainian troops in Novoselivka Persha are effectively trapped and have no realistic option either other than to go on fighting until presumably they've all been destroyed, or perhaps to surrender en masse. I want to stress again, we're not talking about a big cauldron here. We're not talking about hundreds of troops, Ukrainian troops here, probably about several dozen or score, but whatever number it is, it looks as if they're trapped and that the Russians will very soon, perhaps as soon as today, also be in full control of Novoselivka Persha. And of course, the fall of Novoselivka Persha will impact on Russian advances in Karlovka, which is further south. Karlovka is located on the main road towards Selidovo, another important town, which is a major Ukrainian logistical base. If Novoselivka Persha falls, or rather when it falls, the Russians could press forward, capture other villages, Novozelanye, and another village called Marinivka, and maybe other villages too. At that point, Ukrainian defenses in Karlovka, where the Ukrainians are just clinging on to perhaps a third of the village, protected behind two large water reservoirs. Anyway, at that point, Ukrainian positions in Karlovka become undefendable, and the Russians fairly soon will be at the gates of Selidovo itself. Further south still, I mentioned that Gerasimov himself, the overall Russian commander, has visited the Vremevka salient area. He's still there. He's apparently been shown examples of Russian land drones, tracked vehicles that are used in fighting, robot tanks, in other words, mini tanks. He's apparently been shown all of those. Still a lot of speculation as to what exactly Gerasimov is doing there. And there's been an absolutely fascinating report from one of the Ukrainian Telegram channels, I think it is Resident, about the situation with the missile war, Ukraine's missile war against Crimea. And I mentioned in a recent program how Russian drones, the increasing number of Russian surveillance drones, some of them apparently equipped with AI technologies and thermal imaging sensors so that they can operate at night, mean that the Russians are now able to keep almost constant observation on the battlefields and track the position of Ukrainian HIMARS and Patriot launch systems in this area. In effect, significantly reducing Ukrainian ATACMS strikes on Crimea. Anyway, Resident is now claiming that because HIMARS launchers and other Western systems in the Nikolaev, Odessa area, from which they have been striking at Crimea, have become so vulnerable that the Western powers have insisted that they be pulled out and redeployed. And, well, that might be, at least for a while, the end of the missile threat to Crimea. I'm going to end with one last comment, and it goes back to Zelensky. Yesterday, I said that Zelensky had demanded 47 Patriot missile systems. In fact, the actual number that he just demanded was 25. Now, that's apparently 8 batteries per system, and it's quite clear, by the way, that he talked about systems, not batteries. 8 batteries per system. Sometimes, apparently, some Patriot missile systems work with just 4 batteries. But anyway, one way or the other, what Zelensky is demanding is between 100 and 200 Patriot missile batteries to be supplied to Ukraine with all the associated radar equipment and technicians and all of those things. He will also need unlimited supplies of interceptor missiles, to keep this vast army of Patriot launchers fully operational. I don't think anyone, not even Zelensky himself, believes that that is possible. If that is truly the number of Patriot missile launchers that Ukraine needs, well, it becomes even more necessary for Zelensky to begin negotiations with the Russians without delay, and to step down if that's the only way to do it, because he's not going to get 100 to 200 Patriot missile launchers. And if that's what it takes to defend Ukraine, well then Ukraine has well and truly, even on his own figures, now lost. Well, this is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop where we have all our amazing things, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.